There are also more popular incarnations of this. This is one that probably everybody here is familiar with.
Vader was seduced by the dark side of the Force.
The Force?
The Force is what gives the Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together.
All right, so right there you realize, no, wait a second. The Star Wars movie talks about the Force. What is the Force? Well, the Force is everything that actually exists. It's what binds the galaxies together. And it very quickly dawns on anybody who's watched those movies, the Force is actually one thing. The idea that everything is one, the idea that everything is the Force, and there's a light side of the Force, or a good side of the Force, a dark side of the Force, all of that is very much part of this new spiritualist or cosmic humanist theology. The problem, of course, is that it's also really crazy to think about what the implications are when you apply it to modern situations. For example, after September 11th, in which 3,000 innocent people were killed by terrorists in New York City, in Washington, D.C., and in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Richard Gere was asked by David Blaustein of the New York Times, what do you make of this as someone who embraces Buddhism? And Richard Gere said, the terrorists are creating such horrible future lives for themselves because of the negativity of this karma. If you see it from a much wider point of view, we are all in this together. We are all intimately interconnected in all of these actions. Then a disturbing thing comes to the front. Think about this for a minute. If everything is one, then good and evil are the same thing. If good and evil are the same thing, there is no way to discern the difference between the terrorists who died trying to kill people and the firefighters who died trying to save them. This distinction was not lost on the firefighters. In fact, several weeks after September 11th, I was in the New York area. There was a firefighters' benefit in Madison Square Garden. 15,000 firefighters from all over the East Coast came to raise money for the families of their fallen comrades. And Richard Gere had the nerve to come out on the stage and say something like this to the firefighters. I asked one of my buddies, what did you do? He said, we booed him off of the stage. Why did you do that? Because you don't have to be a philosopher to know that some things are just plain wrong. I asked him, well, who else did you boo off of the stage? He said, Hillary Clinton. Right, okay. Yeah. But that's the first point, that everything is spiritual. The second key teaching of the cosmic humanist or new spiritual worldview is that God is within. This is a natural extension of the first point if you think about it for a moment. If everything is one and we call this one thing God, then we are part of it and it is part of us. So where do you turn if you want to find God? You turn inside of yourself. God is within. This idea was actually taught in the 1970s this became sort of the popular modern, what we might call New Age movement, by a lady named Ruth Montgomery. She wrote a book called A World Beyond. Ruth Montgomery was actually quite well known as a political columnist in Washington, D.C. But then she wrote this book, and it was quite an interesting change for her. She actually said that she was not writing this book of her own accord, but that she was channeling a disembodied spirit, a psychic who had passed away, whose name was Arthur Ford. So, the book, A World Beyond, is her writing down what this spirit from beyond the grave told her to write. That's what she said when she wrote the book. And then, so you understand that this is like there's several personalities involved here. There's Ruth Montgomery writing the book, but then there is this supposed disembodied spirit that is writing through her. And the disembodied spirit, Arthur Ford, said, "We are as much God as God is a part of us. Each of us is God. Together we are God. This all for one and one for all makes us the whole of God." People tended to trust that because they said, after all, if what this religion is teaching, if cosmic humanism is true, then disembodied spirits are more purely real than embodied spirits, right? Because they don't have their bodies, they don't have the earth to drag them down. They have more access to truth because ultimately everything is spiritual. So, who actually was talking to Ruth Montgomery? Well, it could be that she was talking to herself. It could be that it was just a gimmick of some kind for her, enabling her to write a best-selling book. But there's actually a significant possibility that she was talking to a disembodied spirit. If the spiritual world actually exists, that is actually a possibility. The question is whether it's a good spirit or a bad spirit. Scripture is very clear that we need to test the spirits, test the things that are told to us. Because just because something is spiritual doesn't mean it's true. All right? What really bothers me most about the idea that God is within is I know my own heart. And I just want to say something to y'all. If I am God, we are all in trouble. And I think I would say the same thing about you. I make a very puny God, which of course which reminds me very much of my second favorite scene from The Avengers.
Enough! You are all of you beneath me. I am a god, you dull creature, and I will not be bullied by that.
Poor Loki. He is a puny god. We would all make puny gods, though, and that is one of the reasons a lot of people are hesitant to embrace this aspect, which is a very common aspect of cosmic humanist or new spiritualist teaching. In fact, it's not just common in the sense that it might show up in a movie or it might show up in Manitou Springs, Colorado. This actually shows up in high places. There is a spiritual teacher. He usually makes the list of one of America's top 10 spiritual teachers. This would put him in a category with people, Billy Graham would almost always make the list of a top spiritual teacher. Rick Warren would make the list. Joyce Meyer would make the list. And then you would find Oprah Winfrey would make the list, and Eckhart Tolle would make the list, and a few other people like that. So because Eckhart Tolle and Oprah Winfrey would always make the list of the top spiritual teachers, it would be interesting to see what happens if they were to actually get together. So they did, for a television interview, on one of Oprah's television shows, she interviewed Eckhart Tolle, and I want you to listen very carefully to the clip, because the clip will reveal to you how somebody who is a very popular spiritual teacher who sold millions of copies of his various books will actually not come right out and say, "We are God." But he will say that, but in a way that is much more nuanced and maybe therefore maybe even more dangerous. But this is probably the way it will be phrased to you by people who embrace this worldview. I do want to make one caveat as we go into this. It is very clear to me, I'll just go ahead and get this out of the way because this is going to be the elephant in the room. It is very clear to me in watching this video clip that Oprah Winfrey has a total crush on this guy. Okay, and so the interview is a little bit over the top. Now that I have said that, we just got that out of the way, listen carefully to what Eckhart Tolle says to Oprah in the interview.
One of the things that you did after the New Earth seminars, you wrote a book called Oneness with All Life, a companion to a new earth, which says many of the things that are in New Earth, but it's not It's not like a summarized version of New Earth.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, this is what I loved from Oneness with All Life. This is also right next to my bed, my signed copy from you. You say, through the present moment, you have access to the power of life itself. The power of life itself. That which has traditionally been called God, which I thought is such a beautiful definition of God. The power of life itself. As soon as you turn away from it, God ceases to be a reality in your life, and all you're left with is the mental concept of God. The mental concept, which is what a lot of people talk about.
Yes.
The mental concept of God, their belief in God. And what you go on to say is, which some people believe in and others deny. Even belief in God is only a poor substitute for the living reality of God manifesting every moment of your life.
Yes.
I think that is such a beautiful offering for
Yes.
Super Bowl Sunday.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's stepping from belief, which is fine, going to the deeper level where belief becomes an actual realization or a knowing. And that can start with a simple thing like, and anybody can verify that in their own experience.
How?
When you take your attention into the present moment, which implies, of course, a certain alertness arises.
Yes, yes.
Which is different from thinking. Thinking, compared to that, is almost like a kind of dreamlike state. You're up here,
Yes.
not present here. So a certain alertness arises. You become more conscious of what surrounds you. But also, strangely, it's hard to talk about it, but I will, of a sense of presence that is both within and without.
Yes.
A presence. We could call that it a divine presence.
Yes.
There is something.
And that presence, what everybody needs to know, is the presence that you feel when you're able to silence your mind.
Silence your mind.
And be aware of the silence that's in your mind. You are that awareness.
Yes.
Disguised as a person.
Yes. And when you become conscious of the gap between two thoughts, for example, or even now, sometimes I even recommend to people that they hold their hands like this and they create this, let's say, past is there, future is there, you let them go, now you bring your attention to just the present. It can be a little reminder to help you hold that sense of presence,
And to recognize
present
that the
moment
past is
awareness.
here and the future is here,
Yes.
and that the only moment that matters is right now.
The only thing you ever
Have.
have is now.
All right. All right, let's talk about that for a moment. And let me, because I know this is a hard thing to really try to process through, we ought to acknowledge the fact that these are two very genuinely smart, thoughtful people trying to work through something that every human being has had to try to work through. How are we to understand and explain God? You have Eckhart Tolle, who is this spiritual teacher coming from more of a New Age tradition, and then you have Oprah, who claims to be a born-again Christian. She's obviously a very smart person. She interviews thousands of people, and she's made probably $1 billion on her various television shows. She's a very smart person, but then she has somehow integrated some of these New Age teachings into what she considers to be her Christian belief. Now, that's an interesting convergence of ideas. And as we talk about this, we also should recognize that everybody watching that would recognize some truth in what's being said, right? If God is actually everywhere, we can actually sense God's presence. But then he turns a corner, doesn't he? And what does he say about God's presence? It is within, it is without. Yes. Yeah. That you are, and then Oprah says, you are that awareness disguised as a person. So your personhood isn't related to your physical existence, it is related to your being completely spiritual. Do you see that? And then they go on and talk about how you would do this. The past is here, the future is here. You know, sorry, that's the best German accent I can do. But you understand now what he's getting at is trying to get you to focus on this presence. And how do you do it? And this is where it really starts to get, I don't know, a little creepy. How do you focus on it? What do you have to turn off? You have to turn off your mind in order to focus on it. And all of a sudden you start to realize this worldview is something that believes it transcends our mental capacity to even consider the claims of this worldview.